December 12th, 1992. Charles Mix County, South Dakota. After an all-night partying spree, 20-year-old Arnold Archambeau, Arnold's 18-year-old spouse, Ruby Brugier, and Ruby's 17-year-old cousin, Tracy Dion, get into a car accident and crash into a frozen ditch. By the time help arrives at the scene, Tracy is still in the car, but Arnold and Ruby have disappeared. 3 months later, Arnold and Ruby's bodies are found in the ditch just over 75 feet away from the accident scene, and their cause of death is determined to be exposure. However, the investigation turns up some odd discrepancies to suggest the bodies may have been placed there and that Arnold and Ruby were alive during the 3-month window they were missing, but the circumstances of how they died remain shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring a highly requested case which I have not yet covered, the unexplained 1992 deaths of Arnold Archambeau and Ruby Bruguier. This is the story of a young couple who had spent the night drinking and partying alongside Ruby's cousin Tracy Dion, but on a very cold morning, their vehicle crashed and rolled over into a remote ditch. According to Tracy, Arnold and Ruby took off and left her trapped inside the car, and by the time help arrived and daylight hit, the couple had completely vanished. It would not be until after the spring thaw hit 3 months later, when Arnold and Ruby's bodies were found in different spots over 75 feet away from the accident scene, and their cause of death was determined to be exposure. While the simplest explanation would seem to be that the couple died shortly after exiting the crashed vehicle and were missed during the original search, there were a number of odd discrepancies which made the authorities believe that Arnold and Ruby died elsewhere and an unknown party brought their bodies back to the scene months later. This story received national attention when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and when I first saw it on TV during the mid-1990s, I will admit that it completely blew my mind, and I considered it to be one of the most baffling mysteries I had ever come across. Of course, as I got older and wiser, I learned that it was extraordinarily easy for search efforts in remote areas to miss human bodies, and started wondering if the simplest solution was actually the correct one. All that being said, however, unlike the majority of these cases, law enforcement seemed just as passionate as the victims' families about not believing these were just tragic, accidental deaths, as they were insistent that Arnold and Ruby's bodies could not have remained at that location for 3 months, and believed there had to be a lot more to this story. While there was no direct evidence of foul play, this case continues to be heavily discussed 3 decades later, and numerous listeners have still requested that I cover it on the podcast, so I thought I would finally put together an episode and provide my own analysis. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unexplained deaths of Arnold Archambeau and Ruby Brugier. Our story begins in Charles Mix County, South Dakota in 1992, and our two victims are a young couple who belong to the Yankton Sioux tribe, 20-year-old Arnold Archambeau and 18-year-old Ruby Brugier. They both grew up on the tribe's reservation in the town of Wagner, but while Ruby hailed from a family of 8 children, Arnold would mostly be raised by his grandmother, as his mother passed away when he was 13 years old. Arnold and Ruby started dating when they were in high school, but while they have never married, they currently have a 19-month-old daughter named Erica. At this particular point, the couple and their daughter are living in Lake Andes with one of Arnold's aunts, while Arnold is employed at the Fort Randall Casino and Hotel. On the evening of Friday, December the 11th, Arnold and Ruby decided to embark on an all-night partying spree with Ruby's 17-year-old cousin, Tracy Dion, and arranged to leave Erica with Tracy's family. After the trio spent several hours visiting friends and drinking at various locations, Arnold drove them back to Tracy's residence in his Chevrolet Monte Carlo. They arrived at around 6 a.m. on the morning of Saturday, December the 12th, in order to drop off Tracy and pick up Erica, but Tracy's father walked outside to greet them and asked Arnold if he had been drinking. Since Arnold replied yes, Tracy's father decided that it would be a better idea for them to come back and pick up Erica later that day after they sobered up. The group agreed to this, and Tracy told her father that she wanted to stay with Arnold and Ruby before they drove away. But shortly thereafter, a tragic and bizarre incident would occur. About 1 hour later, Arnold's Monte Carlo was discovered lying upside down in a frozen-over ditch, which was 100 feet by 25 feet wide, and located between U.S. Route 281 and an abandoned rail bed about a quarter-mile east of Lake Andes. When police and paramedics arrived at the scene, they discovered Tracy's body trapped inside the car, but Arnold and Ruby were nowhere to be found. Tracy was removed from the vehicle and received medical attention, and would later tell the authorities that shortly after leaving her family's house, Arnold drove the Monte Carlo to a 3-way intersection and stopped. After checking to make sure no cars were coming, Arnold turned left onto Route 281, but shortly thereafter, he hit a patch of black ice, causing the car to spin out of control and overturn before it crashed upside down into the ditch. After the accident took place, Tracy said that she could no longer see Arnold inside the car, but Ruby was still trapped in there and started to cry and panic. She repeatedly hit the car in frustration, and this caused the passenger side door to slide open just enough for Ruby to crawl outside. When Tracy tried to crawl towards this opening, the door suddenly slammed shut, but even though she cried out for Arnold and Ruby to come back and help her, Tracy said she never saw them again and remained trapped in the car until help arrived. When daylight finally hit, the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office started performing a search of the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby. Since it was a very cold morning, there was fear that the couple may have died of exposure or fallen through some ice in either the ditch or the nearby lake, which were frozen over at the time. However, the search failed to turn up any trace of the missing couple or any evidence they might have fallen through some ice. For this reason, the authorities initially speculated that Arnold and Ruby had run off somewhere in order to hide out, because Arnold feared that he was going to face serious legal consequences for the accident and get charged with a DUI. But months would pass without the couple resurfacing or making any attempt to get in touch with their families, who feared that something bad must have happened, since they did not believe they would have willingly abandoned their infant daughter. For nearly 3 months, Arnold and Ruby's disappearances got virtually no coverage in the media, but on March the 5th, 1993, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police in Wagner told the media they were requesting the assistance of the state's Division of Criminal Investigation in order to find the missing couple, and their families were offering a $1,000 reward for information. Well, only 5 days later, on March the 10th, there would finally be some answers. By this point, the spring thaw had already hit, and the ice in the ditch between Route 281 and the abandoned rail bed had melted. On this particular morning, a motorist driving down Route 281 noticed a body floating in about 4 feet of water and contacted the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office. When they arrived at the scene, they discovered that the body belonged to a female, but even though she was heavily decomposed, they were able to instantly identify her as Ruby Brugier due to a tattoo on her body which was still visible. Even though Ruby's eyeglasses and shoes were missing, she was still dressed in the same clothes she had been wearing on the night she vanished, and her body was found at a spot that was only about 75 feet from the crash scene. The discovery prompted the sheriff's office to pump all the water out of the ditch, and at around noon the following day, they discovered a second body which was lying only about 15 feet away from the spot where Ruby had been found. Unlike Ruby, this body was not heavily decomposed, so he was immediately recognized and identified as Arnold Archambeau. Arnold's body and clothing had not been frozen to the ground, and investigators would later say that there was some question about whether or not he was still wearing the same clothes he had on the night he went missing. The bodies were transported to the Minnehaha County coroner, who performed autopsies on the two victims. Even though the coroner was unable to determine the exact time Arnold and Ruby died, he found no direct evidence of foul play, and since they did not suffer any serious injuries in the car accident, the official cause of death was determined to be exposure. On March the 19th, a press conference was held in which Arnold and Ruby's families openly expressed their dissatisfaction with the police investigation and their inability to find the couple until 3 months after they vanished. Indeed, their information was never entered into any national databases of missing persons, since the local authorities believed that neither of them would have left the area and they would eventually resurface. One of Ruby's aunts, Sharon Asatoyer, stated, quote, "When a Native American is charged with something, it's pursued heavily. However, when a Native American is a victim, it's not pursued with the same perseverance." End quote. When asked if police had taken photographs of the accident scene or the ditch where the bodies were found, Charles Mix County Deputy Sheriff Bill Youngstrom claimed that they did, but a processing error caused all the negatives to go blank. Youngstrom would maintain that the ditch was searched several times during the 3-month window when Arnold and Ruby were missing, and maintained that no one saw any bodies. While there had been freezing drizzle on the morning of the accident, there had not been any snowfall, so Youngstrom believed that the bodies could not have been missed that day and remained at that spot for the next 3 months. This opinion was shared by the victims' families, as well as Charles Mix County State's Attorney Tim Whalen, who told the press that no less than 6 witnesses had reported seeing Arnold and Ruby between December of 1992 and March of 1993. In fact, Whalen claimed that one witness saw Ruby and Arnold getting into a car following the accident, which was headed east, and the most recent sighting of Ruby took place on January the 20th in her hometown of Wagner. Deputy Youngstrom would later say that he collected sworn affidavits from other people who had walked through the ditch during the 3-month window Arnold and Ruby were missing, and concurred that their bodies were not there. The spring thaw had actually hit shortly after the start of the new year, and by January the 31st, most of the snow in the ditches had melted and left behind very little meltwater, so the area between Route 281 and the rail bed was largely bare and dry. On that particular day, a local resident claimed that he rode through this area on horseback in order to search for a missing hubcap, but did not see either of the 2 bodies. The local authorities became convinced that Arnold and Ruby had died at another location, and someone went to the trouble of bringing their bodies back to the ditch sometime in March in order to give off the false impression that they had wandered off and died of exposure after the accident. Shortly after their bodies were found, the sheriff's office had performed another search of the area and found a tuft of hair which was lying alongside Route 281. Forensic testing would later determine that the hair did belong to Ruby, but Deputy Youngstrom had a hard time believing that it could have remained undisturbed at that spot in the elements for 3 months, so he suspected that the hair may have come off Ruby's head while her body was being placed in the ditch. Another odd detail was a set of keys found inside Arnold's pocket when his body was discovered. One of the keys appeared to belong to a vehicle, while the other 2 seemed to belong to a house, but the keys did not belong to Arnold's Monte Carlo or his aunt's house where he was living at that time. Investigators were unable to match the keys to any vehicles or residences connected to Arnold, which led to speculation that he may have been alive and hiding out somewhere during the 3-month window he was missing. The fact that Arnold and Ruby had different levels of decomposition on their bodies also seemed to point towards the possibility that they had died at different times. I previously mentioned that 6 witnesses reported having seen Arnold and or Ruby alive between the morning of the accident and the morning their bodies were found, but the most intriguing sighting was provided by a woman who claimed she saw Arnold inside a car with 3 other people on New Year's Eve of 1992. This witness knew Arnold personally and said that she even spoke with him, and when given a polygraph after sharing her story, she wound up passing. 2 of the 3 people supposedly seen inside the vehicle with Arnold were a couple who had been sitting in the back seat, so they were tracked down and questioned. The couple claimed that the witness's story wasn't true, as they denied having been out with Arnold on New Year's Eve and insisted they were at home that night. However, unlike the witness, both of these people wound up failing polygraphs. In spite of this, no evidence could be found to conclusively prove that Arnold and Ruby were still alive between December of 1992 and March of 1993. The original reward for information was eventually raised from $1,000 to $5,000, and after one of Ruby's cousins submitted their story to Unsolved Mysteries, the show agreed to produce a segment about the case, which would be featured in an episode that aired in April of 1995. By this point, Ruby's parents had legally adopted her daughter Erica, who was briefly featured on camera during the segment, and Deputy Youngstrom stated that he wanted to be able to tell that girl what happened to her parents. The episode helped bring in about 25 to 30 new tips, including a phone call from North Dakota about 2 men in a Blazer-type vehicle supposedly being seen near the spot where Ruby and Arnold's bodies were found a few hours before their discovery. In the end, none of these new tips panned out, but months after the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired, a lawsuit was filed in federal court over reservation boundaries, and this led to a temporary injunction which prevented state and local law enforcement from holding jurisdiction over the Yankton Sioux Tribe's reservation, which meant that the FBI could take over the investigation into Arnold and Ruby's deaths. They proceeded to work on the case for nearly 4 years, but in September of 1999, the FBI announced that they had failed to find any evidence of foul play or that a crime of any sort had taken place, so they were closing their investigation. However, the victims' loved ones and many members of local law enforcement continue to believe that Arnold and Ruby did not simply die of exposure in the ditch. In January of 2011, Charles Mix County Sheriff Ray Westendorf retired after 28 years of service and told the press that he still considered this to be the most puzzling case of his career, stating, quote, "I believe they were placed in the ditch after they passed away someplace else. I do know that they weren't there in January. It's pretty hard to prove somebody was murdered when you don't have any evidence to prove it." End quote. Whatever happened, after 3 decades, the deaths of Arnold Archambeau and Ruby Brugier continue to remain shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, this is a story which completely blew my mind when I first saw it on Unsolved Mysteries back during the mid-1990s. Hell, since the 90s was the era of stuff like the X-Files and Alien Autopsy, and the world seemed to have a major obsession with aliens, I started wondering if UFOs might have abducted Arnold Archambeau and Ruby Brugier and kept them for 3 months before dropping their bodies back off at the very same place they disappeared from. Hey, what can I say? I was still a teenager and much less of a skeptic back then. I know that law enforcement was adamant that they performed a thorough search of the area surrounding the accident scene and found nothing, so they were absolutely certain that Arnold and Ruby's bodies could not have been there the entire time without being found. Of course, the internet was still in its infancy back then, but when I finally got to participate in online discussions about this case many years later, I found that the majority consensus seemed to be that Arnold and Ruby died of exposure shortly after fleeing the turned-over vehicle, and their bodies were just missed. Whenever I explore any of these suspicious suicide or accidental death cases, there are always some bizarre details which cannot be adequately explained, but you still have to ask yourself, Is it possible to dream up a logical scenario involving foul play which makes any sense? To make a comparison, I had this same reaction when Unsolved Mysteries dropped the first episode of their Netflix reboot about the suspicious suicide of Ray Rivera from the roof of the Belvedere Hotel in Baltimore. The first time I watched the episode, my mind was blown about all the weird oddities surrounding his death, and I could not come up with a logical explanation to account for some of them. But then I realized that none of the theories involving foul play and Ray being thrown to his death made any sense either, which is why I ultimately had to conclude that he likely jumped off the roof on his own accord. Well, the same logic applies here, because while there are admittedly some oddities in this case, the big issue is that there was no hard evidence of foul play, and the coroner determined that the likely cause of death for Arnold and Ruby was exposure. So if there was an outside party involved, does this mean they went to the trouble of abducting two people and murdering them by the process of exposure? All that being said, what really stands out about this case is that law enforcement seemed just as passionate, if not more so, than the victims' families about pushing forward the idea that Arnold and Ruby's bodies could not have been in the ditch the entire 3 months they were missing, so there was no way they died of exposure there right after wandering away from the crash. It's definitely no secret that law enforcement has never had the best track record with investigating cold cases involving indigenous victims, so it would have been very easy for them to simply write off these deaths as being the result of a drunk driving accident before they closed the investigation. The main law enforcement spokesperson was Charles Mix County Deputy Sheriff Bill Youngstrom, who was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, and seemed certain that there was a lot more to this story. His sentiments were also shared by State's Attorney Tim Whalen and Charles Mix County Sheriff Ray Westendorf, as following his retirement 2 decades later, Westendorf was still telling the media about how this case haunted him and sticking to his belief that Arnold and Ruby were not in the ditch during that entire 3-month window of time. Now, it's no big secret that Unsolved Mysteries would sometimes go out of their way to paint their stories as being more mysterious than they really were, but many years ago, I remember reading a great comment online about why they may have agreed to feature this case. Since the show was based out of California, there's a good chance that they greatly underestimated just how cold it can get during the winter in South Dakota. In other words, if Arnold and Ruby fell through the ice in the ditch and found themselves submerged in water, it could have quickly frozen over before anyone had the opportunity to launch a search for them, and as a result, the bodies wound up being missed. But then again, we have law enforcement figures who live in the area and would have been well aware of the weather conditions during late 1992 and early 1993, and they kept saying it was very unlikely that the bodies could have frozen over and gone unnoticed for such a lengthy amount of time. However, was law enforcement acting this way because they genuinely believed foul play might have taken place? Or was this done for the purposes of PR? I used to hold some admiration for Deputy Youngstrom, as he did sound genuinely passionate and sincere during his Unsolved Mysteries interview about solving this case and finding answers for the 2 victims' families. When he said that he personally searched the ditch several times and that Arnold and Ruby must have died at another location before their bodies were placed there, I believed him. But it looks like Youngstrom turned out to be a bit of a problematic character. In May of 2000, Youngstrom was suspended from his job and subsequently charged with embezzling more than $30,000, which had been set aside to arrest drug dealers. Youngstrom had been heading up the Charles Mix County anti-drug program, but over the course of one 2.5-year period, he supposedly fabricated names for non-existent informants and recipients in order to allocate money to the program, and then he used this money to go gambling. When he went on trial, Youngstrom was found guilty of a federal embezzlement charge and received a sentence of 6 months in federal prison, followed by 6 months of house arrest and 3 years probation following his release, and he was also ordered to pay $30,000 in restitution. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that Youngstrom's original assessment of this case was wrong, but when an investigator like this winds up getting into trouble with the law, it causes me to seriously question their judgment. When looking through the newspaper archives, the earliest articles I could find about this case were published on March the 5th, 1993, which was nearly 3 months after Arnold and Ruby went missing. The investigation was being handled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police in Wagner, which consists of federal police officers who have jurisdiction over crimes which take place on reservations, though I believe the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office still technically had jurisdiction here, since Arnold and Ruby vanished just on the edge of the reservation. But lo and behold, after nearly 3 months of virtually no media coverage, Arnold and Ruby's body suddenly turned up within days, and their families were none too pleased. I think there's a good chance that the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office did not exert as much effort trying to find the couple as they claimed to, but since the bodies turned up only about 75 feet away from the accident scene, I'm sure the local authorities knew that it was going to make them look very bad if it turned out they missed them the entire time. So therefore, it was probably in their best interest to push forward a narrative that Arnold and Ruby were elsewhere during that 3-month window before their bodies were placed back in the ditch, so they assured their families that they were going to do whatever it took to find out what happened to them. I know that Youngstrom claimed that he personally walked through these ditches several times and never saw anything, but given that he later went to prison for skimming anti-drug program money for the purposes of gambling, I'm willing to believe that he may not have been entirely truthful about everything. After a federal agency like the Bureau of Indian Affairs became involved in the investigation and took it to the media, I can see Charles Mix County authorities suddenly becoming a lot more enthusiastic about solving this case in order to cover up their previous mistakes. Of course, I can understand why the victims' loved ones would prefer to cling to a scenario which doesn't involve Arnold and Ruby being killed in a manner that was related to Arnold's drunk driving. While a number of their family members have done interviews with the media and on Unsolved Mysteries, including Tracy Dion, one individual whom I have never seen speak is Tracy's father. As you recall, he was looking after Arnold and Ruby's daughter Erica while they were out partying and drinking, and when the group showed up at his residence to pick Erica up that morning, he advised Arnold to come back after he sobered up. It certainly seems odd that Tracy's father would make the wise decision not to allow an infant girl to get into a car being driven by an intoxicated person, but then have no qualms about allowing Arnold to drive away on his own in that condition, particularly when his own daughter was a passenger. Given what ultimately happened, I'm sure Tracy's father felt immense guilt over not taking Arnold's keys, and he should count himself lucky that Tracy was not killed as well. This is certainly not the only case I've seen in which a deceased victim's family has attempted to push forward some sort of conspiracy theory narrative in order to avoid dealing with the fact that they died as the result of driving drunk. But let's look at this whole series of events from beginning to end and try to figure out what happened here. Technically, we only have Tracy's account of how the vehicle crashed into the ditch, as she claimed this occurred after Arnold turned left at an intersection on Route 281, and they soon swerved off the road and rolled over after hitting a patch of black ice. The next thing Tracy remembers is that she and Ruby were upside down inside the Monte Carlo and there was no sign of Arnold, so it's possible that he was thrown from the vehicle during the crash. According to Tracy, Ruby was able to escape from the vehicle on her own, but left her behind, so Tracy did not make it out until help arrived at the scene. Tracy has always said that she could not believe Arnold and Ruby would just abandon her like that, which is why she suspects that something may have happened to the couple that was beyond their control. Of course, when people are intoxicated and experience a traumatic ordeal like this, they are not always going to be in the most rational state of mind, so I could see Arnold and Ruby escaping from the car and attempting to run away without Tracy. Since her account does sound unusual, some people have wondered if Tracy is not telling the full truth about what happened, but you have to remember that she experienced a traumatic ordeal herself, so any inconsistencies in her story may be the result of her misremembering rather than intentionally lying. The autopsy determined that Arnold and Ruby did not have any serious injuries from the accident, so that obviously wouldn't have been what killed them. If they were actually at that location the entire 3 months they were missing, they likely wandered away from the crash scene, possibly well disoriented, and may have fallen through the ice on a frozen-over section of the ditch. And since it was not daylight yet, and the weather was quite cold, the ice may have frozen over and concealed the couple's bodies, so that by the time police arrived at the scene, they were unable to find them. Yes, there is some question about whether the ditch could have frozen over that quickly, but the problem is that it's hard to come up with an alternative scenario involving an outside party, which makes much sense. Tracy specifically said there were no other cars coming when Arnold turned at the intersection, so if she is telling the truth, then that means that sometime after the Monte Carlo flipped over, an outside party arrived at the scene and, for reasons unknown, they picked up Arnold and Ruby and took them away while leaving Tracy behind. What are the odds of something like this happening shortly before 7 a.m. on that particular stretch of road? If something else happened out there besides a simple accident, why has Tracy gone 3 decades without telling the truth? If there was foul play, or something else nefarious which took place, why would the responsible party leave Tracy alive to potentially share the truth? Now, I will admit that since he was intoxicated, the idea of Arnold running away from the scene and hiding out for a while to avoid being charged with a DUI and potentially sent to jail is not that absurd. Deputy Youngstrom even acknowledged that he initially thought this might have been what happened, as he had personally seen other cases of intoxicated people fleeing the scenes of DUI-related crashes and hiding out to avoid facing the consequences. But I'd wager that in those other cases, the people who took off didn't wind up right back at the accident scene 3 months after the fact. Some of the media accounts of this case do mention that a witness had reported seeing Arnold and Ruby getting into a car that morning which was headed east, but we don't have too many specific details about this lead, and the fact that it wasn't even mentioned during the Unsolved Mysteries segment makes me wonder if law enforcement ultimately determined that the sighting wasn't credible. But theoretically, if Arnold and Ruby decided to flee the scene in order to hide out, how exactly did they arrange this? Remember, this was back in 1992, and I'm guessing that neither of them possessed a cell phone at that time, so it would be quite a coincidence if someone who knew the couple just happened to drive by that spot during the early morning hours and agreed to pick them up and help shelter them. But then again, the crash occurred only about a quarter mile outside Lake Andes, which is where Arnold and Ruby were living at that time, so I guess it's not impossible that they could have walked to town and found a place to hide. The Unsolved Mysteries segment only focused on the eyewitness sighting of Arnold, which occurred on New Year's Eve, which I'll discuss momentarily, but it is interesting how no less than 6 witnesses reported having seen Arnold and or Ruby at various locations during the 3-month window they were missing. But of course, eyewitnesses can be mistaken all the time, so it's possible that they were just confused about the exact dates they saw Arnold and Ruby, or mixed them up with some other people they saw. There does seem to be more evidence suggesting that Arnold could have been alive following the crash, rather than Ruby, as she was found with a higher level of decomposition on her body and was determined to be wearing the same clothes she wore on the night she went missing. With Arnold, it's not quite as clear if he was wearing the same clothes, though that could be the result of people forgetting or misremembering what he wore. But supposing that Ruby did die on the night of the accident, did someone go to the trouble of storing her body in a freezer for 3 months before they brought her back to the scene? And after Ruby's death was covered up, did someone then decide to murder Arnold via exposure? The local authorities seem to think that the different levels of decomposition on the couple's bodies were evidence that they each died at different times, but after Ruby's body was found, they had to pump water out of the ditch in order to find Arnold. This suggests to me that if they both fell through the ice, Arnold may have wound up submerged deeper in the water, which would account for why he didn't decompose as badly as Ruby. One reason Deputy Youngstrom believed that Ruby died elsewhere was because he found a tuft of her hair by the side of the road following the discovery of her body, and since he did not think that the hair would have been missed for 3 months, he suspected that it came off Ruby's head while her body was being returned to the scene. Well, it goes without saying that if the search efforts missed an entire body, I don't see why it's impossible that they could have also missed a tuft of hair. It's not like they were specifically looking for hair, so I don't find it surprising that after discovering the bodies at that location, investigators might suddenly become a lot more observant and thorough while searching the area again, and then notice something which may have been there the entire time. Or, if Ruby was decomposing, how do we know that this hair couldn't have become attached from her head, and the wind blew it closer to the road or something? I do admittedly find it unusual that they never found Ruby's glasses or shoes, but she was found submerged in water, so for all we know, perhaps they came off her body and floated elsewhere and were just never found. The other big clue which investigators believe was evidence that Arnold was elsewhere for 3 months were the mysterious set of keys found in his pocket, which could not be matched to any known vehicle or residence connected to him. While I can't be certain of this, I'm assuming that the key to Arnold's Monte Carlo was left in the ignition following the crash, and that it may have been on the same key ring as the key to his aunt's house where he was living at the time. If that's the case, then it is pretty odd that Arnold would have this extra set of keys which could not be accounted for, as this opens up the possibility that Arnold could have been hiding out somewhere to avoid facing consequences for the accident, and someone gave him a set of keys for another vehicle and a residence that he could use. But then why would they leave these keys in Arnold's pocket when they dumped his body, as that only increases the chances of his death being traced back to them? Now, the strongest piece of evidence which seemed to support the idea of Arnold hiding out somewhere after the accident is the witness who claimed that she saw him inside a car with 3 other people on New Year's Eve. Once again, eyewitnesses can easily be mistaken, but I guess you have to give this sighting a bit more credence than usual, since it was from someone who knew Arnold personally and actually spoke to him. And while it's possible she could have been mistaken about when exactly she saw Arnold, New Year's Eve is a pretty distinctive date to remember. Details are vague, but I'm wondering if the witness had not yet learned Arnold was a missing person at that point, because otherwise you'd think she would show a lot more urgency. The witness did pass a polygraph after sharing her story, but putting aside the issue of how unreliable polygraphs are, I don't think these results prove anything, because even if she was mistaken about having seen Arnold, it's probably not going to register as deception if she genuinely believes that she saw him and is telling the truth. The witness described Arnold as being inside a car with 3 people, and while I'm not sure how accurate this is, the Unsolved Mysteries segment presented a reenactment of the witness speaking to an actor portraying Arnold while he's sitting behind the wheel before he drives away. So if this is how she described it, then this suggests that someone could have given Arnold the key to another vehicle to use while he was hiding. This reenactment also shows a woman sitting in the front passenger seat next to Arnold, while a couple is sitting in the back seat. While we know police questioned this couple who were supposedly in the car, they never said anything about this third passenger, so I'm assuming that perhaps the eyewitness didn't know who she was and they were never identified. Regardless, when the couple was questioned, they denied ever seeing Arnold and claimed they were at home on New Year's Eve, but wound up failing a polygraph. Once again, polygraphs are unreliable, but theoretically, even if they are telling the truth about not being with Arnold, I suppose an alternate explanation for them failing is that they may have spent New Year's Eve doing something which they didn't want to discuss with law enforcement, such as drugs, which could have explained why the results showed signs of deception. But without knowing any more specific details about this couple, or the circumstances of how this encounter with Arnold took place, it's hard to really determine the veracity of this witness's story. Like I mentioned earlier, this case didn't get any attention in the media until March the 5th, 1993, 5 days before the discovery of the bodies, so if you believe that foul play or a cover-up took place, then perhaps someone who was complicit in hiding Arnold and/or Ruby wound up panicking and decided to kill one or both of them and then subsequently dump their bodies in the ditch to make it look like they died right after the accident took place. But I don't know, that seems like a pretty complicated and sophisticated crime, and since there was no evidence on either of their bodies to indicate foul play, how exactly could someone murder them? Lock them outside in the cold somewhere so that they could die of exposure? Even if Arnold was attempting to avoid DUI charges, how long could he expect to hide out? It's not like he could just live off the grid and avoid all contact with his family indefinitely, and it seems weird that he would be out in public on New Year's Eve interacting with people he knew if he was attempting to lay low. And if Arnold did feel compelled to hide out to avoid legal trouble, would Ruby really do the same thing? After all, she wasn't the one driving. During the time period the couple was missing, Ruby's family said they had a hard time believing that she would willingly abandon her infant daughter since she was breastfeeding her at the time. Overall, when you look at all the known facts, there is no theory about Arnold and Ruby disappearing from the accident scene and dying at another location which makes any sense. In virtually all of these suspicious death cases, you're going to find some oddities which cannot be adequately explained, but you always have to ask yourself, is any scenario involving accidental death going to be less logical than any scenario involving foul play? Well, in this case, I would say no. Look, I'll be the first to admit that there are still some weird things which don't add up, and like I've already said, there was a time when I used to think this mystery was just as baffling and unexplainable as, say, the Aileen Conway case. If podcasting had been a thing during the 1990s, and I was able to launch The Trail Went Cold back then, I probably would have made this the subject of one of my very first episodes, rather than waiting 8.5 years in order to cover it on episode number 388. But after all these years, I have seen so many other cases in which a person went missing in a remote area and the initial search effort failed to find them, only for the remains to turn up in that exact same spot at a later time. There is never a 100% guarantee that even the best search effort is going to uncover a deceased victim. One reason the authorities seem inclined to believe that Arnold and Ruby did not die in the ditch is because after the first spring thaw took place in late January of 1993, a local resident supposedly rode through the ditches on horseback and did not see either of the couple's bodies. But remember, this guy was looking for a missing hubcap rather than specifically looking for any bodies, and human memory can be fallible. Arnold and Ruby were not actually found until a month and a half later, so for all we know, he could have been mistaken about the exact area where he rode his horse. You can definitely criticize the original investigation from the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office, but let's not forget that it was taken over by the FBI for a few years, and they were unable to find any evidence that foul play took place. Even though the FBI closed the case, it appears that some law enforcement figures in Charles Mix County continue to believe that something suspicious took place, but did they genuinely believe that? Or were they just overcompensating in order to avoid admitting their own mistakes? Whatever the case, there have never been any compelling suspects or motives pushed forward about why anyone would want Arnold and Ruby dead. And since I cannot think of any scenarios involving foul play which make much in the way of sense, I definitely have to go with the simplest explanation and conclude that they both died in the ditch shortly after the accident, and their bodies were just concealed and not found for 3 months. Had this story not garnered the attention of Unsolved Mysteries, I'm sure most people would have never even heard of it, but once it received coverage on a national TV show, that pretty much ensured that people will continue to debate the case until the end of time, even though there is only one truly logical explanation here. All that being said, if you happen to have any information about the deaths of Arnold Archambeau and Ruby Brugier, which does point towards them being the victims of foul play, please contact the Charles Mix County Sheriff's Office at 605-487-7625. That's 605-487-7625. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released over 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I actually took a break from my usual true crime content and released another movie-themed episode, this time counting down my top 10 favorite movie villains. In addition, I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my 2 co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a case from Australia about a missing boat, the 1988 disappearance of the Patnella. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I have recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I just wanted to remind everyone that 2 months from now, The Trail Went Cold will be traveling to London to appear on Podcast Row at CrimeCon UK, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLD24. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk and the promo code is COLD24 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter or Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.